audience members are either international officers who deal with international students, international programs, just to develop the internationalization agendas of the universities, or we have academics who have responsibilities in international programs such as Department Erasmus coordinators. So it's a mixed audience, and I'm sure they will benefit from your webinar today. So the floor is yours for a presentation. Then, if our audience has any questions, I will kindly ask them to put your questions in the chat box so that Daniel can answer at the end of his presentation. Daniel, do you want to say a few words and then start sharing your slides with us?
Of course. So first of all, thank you very much for this kind and warm welcome. It's been a long time that we've been in touch, as it were. I very fondly remember the conference, 1.5 or 2 years ago now, almost. And I wish there was ways that we could have it in person as well very soon again. I would very much enjoy that. As mentioned before, my name is Daniel Dauber. I'm from the University of Warwick, and I'm happy to be part of this webinar today and having the opportunity to share my insights from my research, but also from my work with different institutions regarding how we can foster global communication skills, especially in a time where communication has become even more difficult and more challenging, and requires more from our graduates when they hit the job markets, having to not only be able to work in teams, but also in virtual teams, much more likely, especially now. If for whatever reason your internet connection starts to fail on you, I would like to share a link with you in the chat. This is the link to the slides that you will see through my screen sharing that I will do right now. So if Zoom or whatever breaks down, you still have the opportunity to at least follow along, but obviously you won't hear my voice. That's the only downside. Okay. All right. I hope you can see the screen. Yes, with presentation slides. Perfect. So the webinar's topic today is one that's very dear to my heart and something that I've spent lots and lots of time in the last couple of 5 years, or maybe even more. And it's all started with, of course, my personal experiences at my own university, at the University of Warwick, where we very much foster internationalization in every way possible. And there are certain challenges. The challenge is not to internationalize, I think. The challenge is not to bring students from different corners of the world together to study together. Obviously, now it's maybe a little bit more tricky with the travel restrictions, but obviously we overcome these as well, and started to introduce hybrid modes of teaching and learning, obviously, but also fully digitalized programs that exist in different universities to cater to the needs of students. So internationalization per se is not really the challenge by itself, if we define it very narrowly as bringing students together from different places of the world and creating a diverse campus experience. The challenges are more, how can students make use of the diversity that they're exposed to? How can they actually learn something by just being there? And I don't mean in the curriculum itself. There's a lot of research focusing on aspects that are related to what can students learn in the curriculum? How can we internationalize the curriculum? But actually, there are also other areas, especially outside the curriculum, where students probably spend 80% of their time, so maybe a little less, maybe a little more in some cases. Students are not with us in the classroom. They spend more time outside of the classroom, socializing with others, working on their assignments, sitting in the library, being in study groups, being in clubs or whatever, in interest groups on campus that focus on certain hobbies and whatnot. This is where students spend a lot of time, especially on their undergraduate degrees, I feel like. And the question is just, what can we do for those students? Is there anything we can do? Are there things in place already that we could actually leverage? And that's an area of research where I very much focus on and try to help universities understand the context better. So the presentation is very roughly grouped into 4 big categories that I want to cover, or topics. One is obviously global communication skills. What do I mean by it? What does the field understand as global communication skills? And it might, to some extent, deviate from what you understand as global communication skills. But there is also an aspect that I want to incorporate, which is what do employers understand as global communication skills, which is obviously quite important to know because this is the target market where we send our students out, as managerial and businessy this may sound. Then I'll shortly talk about the tools we use to systematically analyze students' experiences on campus that cannot be captured by the standard benchmarks such as student-staff ratios and whatnot. I particularly will focus on a global education profiler, not just because I'm the co-developer of this tool, but also because it allowed us to give universities insights into areas that previously have been rather hidden, so to speak. Then, of course, I want to talk about results and give some concluding remarks related to these insights and how they might relate to your universities. It's fair to say that actually the sample includes also universities from your network. So it's very likely that some of the students in our data set are actually from your university. To start the journey and to start the story, we need to go somewhere else than the university, actually. We need to go to the place where students go on after they've graduated. Where do our graduates go? What kind of context do they find themselves in? And actually, what are the employers saying? And to some extent, there are less surprising findings to be found when looking at industry reports, such as the British Council reports, the CBI reports, The Economist, and other platforms. They all say global communication skills are highly sought after. And this might not be news to you. However, on the other hand, many of these reports, and most prominently the QS Intelligence Unit report from 2018, emphasize that graduates do not meet the expectations of employers. And you might immediately see some sort of a mismatch, because our job is to create those graduates that employers are looking for. Of course, most of them, and the QS report is no different, the technical expertise the students acquire, yes, these expectations are met by our students from our university. However, there are other skills that are not met that are equally important, to an extent where some universities started to say, some companies, sorry, started to say, you don't need a university degree to work for us. We give you trainee programs. That's no problem. We teach you what you need to know for this job. We don't need a degree anymore from relevant universities. Classic example is PricewaterhouseCoopers, who were questioning the relevance of university degrees. And as much as we might not like it, there is, of course, some reasoning behind this, some of which is related to the fact that maybe some of the skills that students actually easily could learn, as you will see, at our university without much effort actually on the staff side, for example, or with much extra input from the university, but students are just not aware of it. Students can't leverage or understand that there is opportunities to acquire those skills or hone those skills because they're not aware of it or not even motivated to do so. Just giving an idea of what universities in different countries refer to as internationalization, or what the education strategy is. So for example, in the UK, very often and very frequently you find statements like universities should help foster a generation of citizens who can succeed in an increasingly globalized world. And that, of course, goes beyond technical expertise that you get from the degree programs. The Swedish government is even a little bit more precise in their formulation. They say all students who earn a university degree have developed the international understanding or intercultural competence. Here it's very explicit that intercultural competence is quite an important aspect that the Swedish government considers as essential. And again, it's not necessarily that they mean this is something that needs to be taught as a formal lecture. It's something that you would expect that if you study at an internationalized university or internationalizing university, it's something you would gain. And I think for many of us, on the one hand, of course, there is a financial aspect to internationalization of universities, but obviously there is equally a social aspect to internationalization of universities, because we want students from different countries, we want staff from different countries to bring in their own perspectives, their own ways of thinking, because it's enriching and fulfilling on a more personal level. So what exactly are global communication skills, and how can we narrow it down and define it more thoroughly? One thing that I think is quite important to distinguish is global communication skills from foreign language skills. someone might be very fluent in Turkish, for example, might know how to write and how to speak perfectly without any grammar mistakes or syntax errors or whatever. They're very fluent, and you wouldn't even be able to tell them apart from from native speakers of Turkish. However, you might be still able to tell them apart from native speakers because they might use the correct language in the wrong context. So sometimes you might feel like people speak very well, but it sounds weird or odd or unusual to use this phrase in this context. And this is what refers more to the global communication skills aspect rather than to the narrow definition of foreign language use or foreign language skills. So these two obviously are related to each other. If we want students to talk to each other, we need to find ways of communicating with each other, maybe with a common language, or if possible, ideally that people manage to learn different languages, but that takes time and it's also a challenge. So somehow we need to find ways to communicate beyond the foreign language skills element, but actually need to add this global communication skills element. The meaning is not coded or decoded in mechanistic ways, similar to what I've just referred to. It is important that we understand what people say in context and when they say certain things in context. It also refers to aspects of adapting our language to specific contexts. And one of the most important skills, I would argue, in this context is mindfulness of others, mindfulness of the role your language plays in communicating with others. When I talk to my son, and you might have the pleasure of hearing him at some point in the background, I apologize for that in advance. But obviously I talk differently to him as I would talk here in this webinar, or I would talk to my colleagues or to my wife or to my mother-in-law and whatnot. So being very mindful of the context, being very mindful of the recipient of my messages that I send across is very, very important. And also sometimes essential in order to enable the receiver of my message to actually understand me. So if you narrow it further down, we can look, for example, into the context of second language learning, ways to promote mutual understanding. There's a couple of examples that are frequently provided. For example, the manner of delivery. Either longer pauses, shorter pauses. There's even cultural differences in how we determine whether something is appropriate. So is it appropriate for me to now pause for a minute? I think it would be very awkward for most of us because you would expect me to continue to talk. Grammatical complexity. Do we talk or write in case of emails, shorter or longer sentences? Do we use a simple syntax compared to a very complex syntax? I'm a German speaker natively, so I have a tendency to write very complex syntax because in my language, everybody writes sub-sentences, sub-sentences, and sub-sentences, and subclauses over subclauses, which as of today, I find still hard to read when reading journal articles. Then there's obviously lexical complexity, which refers to the, very simply speaking, the frequency of lexical items and the complexity of those. Discourse management in terms of how do we manage and convey information and what kind and how much at a time. And then there's something called discourse pairs, which refers to the clarification, confirmation of repetitions of sentences and information that we provide. So it's a very technical, very niche definition of communication skills. Now, if you want to adapt it a little bit to most of our contexts that we work in, we can take the approach that Helen Spencer, Oti, and Franklin have chosen in 2019 in their publication. They list a couple of aspects that are particularly relevant when trying to develop global communication skills, either in employees, employers, but also, of course, other staff members in other organizations or students, needless to say. So one is message tuning, which directly refers to the indirect meaning of messages. It's indirect signals that we give. It might be a gesture sometimes. So it doesn't have to be always verbal. When we talk about global communication skills, again, I'm not talking about foreign language skills. It's also nonverbal cues that play an important role. Then there's obviously active listening. It doesn't actually refer, the definition of active listening doesn't refer to understanding itself, which again leans more into the foreign language skills aspect to understand what the person said on a technical level. But it's the ability to check and clarify meaning. So if you don't understand, do we have strategies to engage with the other person to elicit the meaning. This is something that a lot of students, in particular when they have struggles with speaking a foreign language, to talk to native speakers and find ways to clarify the meaning of what that person just said, because it could be embarrassing. Or for most of my students, when they say like, I didn't dare ask you in the lecture why this is the case. Well, you could have asked, it's not a problem, but of course they feel intimidated, they feel face threatened, and would therefore not dare to ask questions. And some of them even wait until it's too late. When they submit their assignment and I need to tell them, sorry, this didn't go too well. Why didn't you ask? And it's like, I didn't know how to. And obviously that transcends beyond the classroom context. The building of a shared knowledge, something that many local students here in the UK find difficult, because very often the international students find a common ground to communicate. They speak their own version of English, which sometimes is tough to understand for local students. And when I talk about global communication skills development, I obviously refer to international students and home students at the same time, because that's where the interaction should take place. Linguistic accommodation, to which extent do we adapt our way of speaking? It's very much focused on our ability, not the ability of somebody else, to adapt to the audience. Information structuring and highlighting, that's largely about discourse markers, as it says here. So if you're not familiar with that, you will see some examples later. And then also stylistic flexibility, which kind of links to linguistic accommodation as well, because we use different styles of communicating with people. And this is also subsumed under the term global communication skills. If you look at other sources of information, you will find similar concepts, similar ideas of how we could define global communication skills. But I would argue that one of the most important aspects is accommodating, changing your own style of communication to whatever best fits the context that you're in. And sometimes that requires experimenting, also for students, obviously. So after having defined what global communication skills are, the next question is, so how can we foster, as I said in my title, these skills? How can we help students to create an experience for them, or enable them to have certain experiences that enable them to have these global communication skills and therefore become also more employable? So one of the aspects that make the global education profiler very unique is that it doesn't focus on experiences only. It also captures the motivation aspect of students by asking them, how important are these things to you? And some of the results from the broader data set also reveal that there are some shocking findings. For example, some students don't find it important to be socially integrated into the campus community. And the reason for that might be very legitimate, that they are only interested in earning this degree and then go straight into the job market. And these would probably be one of those students that might actually be those that get pointed out by employers as, this is not the kind of graduate we were looking for. Yes, technically excellent, but not really playing along well with our international team, not playing along very well on international assignments, struggling, having psychological stress, and therefore not working effectively. There's all kinds of consequences that we have to consider when students or our future employees suffer from certain lacks in skills. So motivation here refers particularly to the desire to learn something, or in this case, in particular, learning global communication skills, which without it, students would never do it. And of course, the same is true for staff members as well, if you want to look at university staff members as being enabled to have these global communication skills themselves. We are very goal-oriented as individuals, so we only tend to do things that we actually want to achieve. If it's not our goal to learn global communication skills, if we don't see the relevance of why global communication skills are important, we would not make it a goal to become better, to hone those skills, to foster those skills, or whichever other verb you would like to use. So a crucial role in all this, especially from the university end, is we need to find ways to motivate students to explore the opportunities that are already there very often. Language socialization theory also plays an important role in understanding what factors foster global communication skills. It's all about the opportunity to interact with other people. So language socialization theory, for example, says interaction is important for language development. You cannot just sit at home and do a course online or from a book Learn the language. We're back to the notion of foreign language skills. Yes, that's what you can learn from a book. That's what you can learn from videos online, but it won't enable you to communicate directly with somebody in person in the same way, because there's more ingredients, there's more complexity to our communication. So close interconnection between language and culture is something that we need to account for. Here, Longman used the term culture. Just a couple of slides ago, I referred to context. It's really up to you which word you rather prefer. To me, they are almost identical because different cultural contexts exist, and therefore we need to account for them in some shape or form. Another factor that plays an important role in fostering global communication skills is offering opportunities and support. If you've heard other talks before about culture shocks or intercultural communication in some shape or form and the consequences of, not being able to adapt to different situations, is that students very often suffer from psychological stress in the worst case scenario. So universities need to provide not only opportunities for students to integrate into the campus community, but obviously they also need to support them in exploiting the opportunities that the university already provides. And lastly, also provide mental support or social support for students. I'm a firm believer, and you're welcome to disagree with this, but based also on my personal experiences, it is impossible to develop intercultural competence without having some level of pain associated with it. Because developing intercultural competence skills or global communication skills means I need to push myself out of my comfort zone. Now, when I talk about pain, I'm not necessarily meaning I break my leg and that's the kind of pain. It's most of the time psychological strain, as it were, as I would call it. And we shouldn't let students be by themselves and explore these opportunities and then have very often also negative experiences, which I think are probably the most valuable ones to some extent when it comes to global communication skills development, because some of it is trial and error. There's only so much we can teach them, but if we don't turn this knowledge that we gain, that the universities, probably your universities already provide to your students, if they don't put them into action, there is no way that they could become fluent in global communication skills or communicating with a diverse group of people. So this is another important aspect. We want students to leave their comfort zones. We want students to push themselves to the edge of what is mentally possible for them, but we also want to be there for them, to give them a safety net compared to a working environment after university, where this might not necessarily be the case. And I think we're already doing this in large parts. We already offer students support in all kinds of areas that are not just academic in nature, but also related to other areas of the study experience. Foreign language skills, I will glance over that rather quickly because I already talked a lot about it. Obviously, students who are exposed to foreign languages, already study foreign languages, they're also much more willing to have global communication skills. Very often, these are the students, if they already speak 1, 2 other foreign languages or even more, they have exposed themselves to different cultural contexts, most likely. They probably have visited the countries where these languages are spoken natively. So they understand why it is important. They don't lack this motivation of needing to understand why do I need to learn something else on top? I just want to be an accountant in my dad's company. He's British, I'm British. It's a British company, we have British clients. Until the moment, obviously, you don't have British clients anymore. And it's somebody else from another country that wants to engage your services. Then it suddenly will become more difficult. So proficiency in a foreign language can lead to higher intercultural sensitivity, is something that Wu, for example, in 2016 has found, and obviously also links to global communication skills because of that. So taking everything together and putting it more into an academic framework, as it were, that something that we can actually empirically test and look into and diagnose, as it were, is illustrated here. So there's a couple of assumptions that are made based on the literature, based on other research that was conducted, based on discussions that we had with higher education institutions in the past. And it turns out that the importance of global communication skills, the experience of integration and the opportunities offered and the foreign communication skills experiences that students might have positively affect the development of global communication skills. So it's the combination of all these factors that might lead to a higher perception of having these global communication skills by students. Needless to say, there are many more factors that could be looked at. And you might be wondering, why have we chosen these? The main reason for it is because there is not much done on these factors, and some of them are already available to us. It's something that students are already put into. They're already part of it, where they're supposed to be part of a campus community. The question is just, do they feel that they are part of it to an extent that it goes beyond just a questionnaire item of how satisfied are you with your study experiences? But actually, do you experience interacting with others? Do you make use of opportunities offered by the university? A lot of work, I see universities go at lengths at this, and rightly so, to offer opportunities to students. And some students might say, yeah, it's important to me that the university offers these opportunities, but then actually turn out to not exploit them. For whatever reason, they are not showing up to it. To give a more concrete example, at my university, not my department, but another department where I provided some consulting work, they offered social events in the department labeled as international evenings or intercultural dinners and stuff. And because it was labeled international dinner, one of the local students thought, oh, it's just for international students. That's why it's an international dinner. And they didn't think that they are also part of an international community on campus. So very often it's maybe not even a challenge to convince international students that they are on an international campus. It's very often a challenge to convince local students that they are part of this international community now, even though they never left the country. Certainly, I think in Warwick, we've spent a lot of work on making sure students are aware that they are also international students, even though they don't leave the campus necessarily. So a brief primer on the methodology that we used. The measure, as I mentioned before, is we use a global education profiler. And what's special about it is it measures 4 different areas. It's communication skills development, integration on campus, global opportunities, and foreign language development as key components for developing those skills. We asked students twice in this questionnaire. So it's an online questionnaire that we provide to students also, and some of them filled it in as a hard copy as well. But the unique thing about this questionnaire is that it's measuring things twice. It measures things on 2 scales. It asks students, to which extent is this important to you? For example, to which extent is it important to you to be integrated into the campus community? And to which extent do you actually experience what you just said? Like, to which extent is this important, and to which extent do you experience integration on campus? So it's, on the one hand, capturing the motivation, the desires of students, but on the other hand, also captures what is actually going on. And the big benefit of doing that is you can see discrepancies in what is important to students and what do they actually experience. And it's measured on a 6-point Likert scale, in case you're wondering. Here's some reliability statistics to hopefully convince you that the following results are actually based on sound empirical research and a sound methodology. And then a brief statement about the sample as well, because obviously many of you are here to understand what is the sample that I refer to. This is actually a subsample of the data that we've collected so far. And more work needs to be done to finish looking at the other universities. But this sample consists of over 2,300 students from 5 different countries, including Belgium, Germany, Ireland, UK, and Uruguay. The proportion of men and women were largely the same. You can see there's a slight tendency to have more UG students, simply also because there tend to be more UG students at universities in Europe than there are PG students. But in total, 98 different countries were represented in this data set. So it's quite a diverse data set. Only 55% of the students were domestic, and the other were international or did not disclose their country of origin. If you look at the results from a very statistical point of view, we instantly notice that the importance of communication skills is very, very important to them. Students attach a lot of importance to developing global communication skills. And this might come for some of you as a surprise. Actually, if you look at the last column, 88% of the students indicated that it is is rather important than it's not important. Out of all these, this is the highest score. And if you look at the experience, just the line above of it, you will notice not all of these 88% of participants actually had the same experience. There's at least 18% of students who say it's important, but they didn't really experience it. So that's, of course, worth further investigating. But since it was measured on a scale from 1 to 6, 6 is the highest score, the importance of communication skills was rated as at around 4.6, 4.5. So a lot of students think it's important. Also, a lot of students indicate that actually have the experience of being integrated, but it's only 56% of them, which is not that much overall. Oh, sorry. And when it comes to global opportunities and support by the university, less than half of the students actually experience this, which is kind of a shame, because I think it's less to do, and that's my experience of working with a couple of the institutions, is it's not the lack of existing opportunities. It's students are either not aware of it, or they don't think it's for them, or they haven't simply found time to do it, or other good reasons of why they would not do it. So it's not to say that universities don't provide opportunities. It's very often that students don't recognize it as an opportunity for them to develop certain skills. And foreign language skills development is in a very similar camp in that regard. Needless to say, we also have a large proportion of UK students in the sample, which are probably responsible for this rather low requirement of foreign language skills, because out of all students that we looked at, especially in a bigger data set, English native speakers don't consider foreign language skills as important as students do that don't speak English as a native language. And for many of us, English is the first foreign language that we learn. So we know it is important to us to speak English, because otherwise we might find it hard to communicate with many of the other people around the world. So that might also be not too surprising in that regard. If we look at the relationship between those factors, how do they affect each other? Especially how do these factors affect communication skills experiences, which is what we primarily look at. We want to see whether students feel they have improved in their global communication skills experiences. Almost all of them seem to have a similar and fairly strong relationship to communication skills development. So that's good news. But then if we look at the partial correlations, which takes out the correlations between all the factors among each other, we do start to see a certain pattern emerging. We do see that integration seems to be the most important variable because it has the highest score right after communication skills importance, which means motivation comes first and then integration experience comes second. Now, correlations are not looking at causality or linear relationships. It's assuming a two-way direction. Therefore, we need to use other tools such as regression tools. And here it becomes more and more obvious that on the one hand, all the factors that I just mentioned at the beginning, all of them are important, but not to the same degree. If you look at the first column where it says capital letter B, the bigger that value, the more important it is. So clearly what we just saw in the correlation is replicated in this regression, saying that if we want to foster global communication skills, we first need to make sure the students are motivated to do that. If the lack of motivation is prevalent at your institution, if you find that students don't think it's important, you will have a very hard time, in other words, to help them develop the global communication skills that employers are looking for. So most importantly, raising awareness is something that's very, very important. And I think, especially looking at my university in departments like the business school and whatnot, global communication skills is almost in every lecture, in every program represented. So students know it's important, otherwise they wouldn't be bombarded, especially with this term, communication skills, communication skills, communication skills. Because after all, we always work with other individuals together. So being capable to communicate with them kind of makes sense. But the second most important one mentioned here is integration experience. Now, the integration experience seems to also be very, very essential to students to develop these global communication skills. Now, again, based on what I've mentioned before, this might not come as a big surprise to you, considering that where do we communicate as a student? It's in the classroom on the one hand, with the lecturer, with fellow colleagues, But during the lecture, we're not going to talk all that much. So most of the communication that takes place is actually outside the classroom. The 80% that I referred to at the very beginning of where do students spend most of their time. It's outside, it's together with other students. But shockingly enough, when, I don't know about your students, but certainly with my students, when I talk to them and say, so what did you do when you're not in class? Do you have any hobbies, or what are you engaging in when you're not working on assignments or doing your readings? And of course, they hang out with other students. And when I ask them, do you feel like you can learn something in this context? Do you think what we talked about last week would apply to hanging out with your friends? Shockingly, they say like, oh, I never thought about this. I never thought that actually my outside curriculum activities could be a great learning opportunity or a great playground for me to apply what I've learned in class about intercultural communication, global skills development, and whatnot. So for some odd reason, did not necessarily make this link. And therefore, they don't necessarily perceive social integration as important sometimes, especially on PhD level. With UGs, it's a different story. But certainly, it's the second most important factor in fostering global communication skills that's not related to the curriculum. And last but not least, the other two factors seem to be significant, but not have such a huge impact. But obviously, they go hand in hand with other aspects and therefore shouldn't be neglected as such. Probably you might be wondering what is adjusted R-square at the bottom. And it refers to the percentage of how much this model can explain the global skills development in students in our data set. And it's over almost 64% of what students explain as global communication skills can be explained by this model, which is quite high. We obviously also looked at age and gender. Neither age nor gender seem to have had any impact on whether or not they perceive that they have particularly more or less global communication skills development experiences. So in a way, that's good news. We don't need to worry about gender differences, or we don't need to worry so much about age, which means we also don't need to worry so much about, is it a UG student or is it a PGT student, which is kind of reflected in the age. Most of the UGs are younger than the PGTs for obvious reasons. Seems to make no difference. It works the same for all students, which obviously is tremendously helpful when trying to set up policies, trying to set up triggers or initiatives to help students exploit the opportunities that might or might not yet be present. Some more statistics in terms of whether we can trust these results. I leave them here just for reference in case you have a very statistic keen eye on things. What these results basically indicate is there's nothing that has confused or confounded our model in predicting the global communication skills development. Now, something that probably most of you find most interesting is actually the concluding remarks of this study. What can we actually learn? What actually did the global education profiler tell us that other tools might not have told us before? There's 4 main areas, and there's a 5th one that I want to cover very briefly, because obviously there is one more variable that is not included in here at all. And when the study was conducted, it was conducted before the pandemic. So I also have one more slide that's just dedicated to the impact of the pandemic and the most recent insights related to that as well. So first of all, undoubtedly, motivation matters. No matter what we want to tell students about, we tell them it is important, and we need to tell them why it's important and for whom it is important. It's not just important for themselves, it's also important for the employer that they apply for their job when they leave the university. If there's no motivation, there's no willingness to invest time to hone certain skills. And the universities can try as hard as they want, and as much as they want. They can have the most elaborate, most fantastic experience for students. If they not show up, it's all worth nothing. And I think that's often the bigger challenge. How do we get students into this event? How do we can make students feel this is important? This is not just for fun only. This is something that actually helps you to develop the skills that employers are looking for. And I think more and more universities start to recognize it's not the thing that we offer that makes a difference to students. It's how many students can we actually get to interact with each other outside the curriculum in ways that avoids student homophily, meaning that they stick together. And that's probably the most frequently used term when I interview students is people stick together like glue. And they basically mean that the local students stick together or the international students stick together. It doesn't really matter where students come from or which fee level they have, whether they're home or international students. People like to stick together. And I think this is the thing that universities need to strive for in terms of helping them to unglue themselves in some ways. Most students attach high importance to global communication skills, which is kind of good news. In these universities, students are aware that these are required. This is not something you can just have on the side. This is something you actively need to work on. And that's great news because this is not the case everywhere in the world, that students feel like this is important. Motivation was found to be a key ingredient in developing such competencies, not just in our studies, but in many other studies before us as well. And a nice side effect of being socially integrated and having global communication skills is also there's a higher level of subjective well-being. So if well-being of students is a concern at university, and I would be surprised if it's not, helping students to develop global communication skills means helping them to feel better, to have higher well-being perceptions of themselves, and also less difficulties in interacting with other people, which sometimes are the cause for lack of social or subjective well-being, as it were. Again, I think many UK universities dedicate a lot of resources to mental well-being because it is very stressful, especially during the pandemic. I think this has been asked for by students even more so, because on top of living abroad, they suddenly were faced with the consequences of a deadly virus that seems to spread everywhere, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty, and if you're already in a weak spot, it's not getting better because of the pandemic for obvious reasons. Integration is a key ingredient, as the results have indicated. It's actually not necessary for students anymore to have a global intercultural experience by having to go abroad. No, they can actually have it at home. And I'm sure you've heard this term multiple times by now. It's internationalization at home, which is particularly dedicated to the idea of students that may not be able to afford to go abroad or simply don't want to go abroad still can have an international experience. This is why many universities, including yours, I assume, have internationalization so high up in their agenda. But if students don't feel integrated, if they stick together, to come back to this term, which is metaphor, then nothing is going to happen. We have silos in our campus community. And while this might feel comfortable for the students at the moment, it's not going to help them explore those global communication skills opportunities that you already provide to them. Integration can happen on 3 different levels. That's also important to note. On the one hand, it's the individual level, which very much refers to the student themselves, exposing themselves to situations that are unknown, talking to people they've never met before. Then there's, of course, the community level, which includes more than just the students, also the staff members. And then there's the institutional level, which I think many of you actually belong to and do their work in on a daily basis, is trying to find ways to enable everybody in the university community to have a very integrated approach to communication, a very integrated approach to working together, living together, and teaching and learning together. And as I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, students have a tendency towards homophily. They like to be in their comfort zones. They already struggle with other things on top of having to socially integrate now. They already also need to integrate academically. They need to keep up with the work that they're doing. So I'm not saying it's easy, but that's why we need to have responsibilities taken by the student in the first place to motivate themselves to do things on top of what they're already doing. But then, of course, there's also the responsibility by the university, on the one hand, offering these opportunities, but also having mechanisms to entice them to take those opportunities, to take responsibility and take ownership of their own learning and development. In universities where the fees are very high, it can very quickly happen that students have the perception of, I've paid so much money, you need to serve me now. And the thing is, yes, we serve you knowledge, but we can't serve you experiences, in the sense that we can give you opportunities to experience things, but you need to go there. You need to do it. You need to do them. You need to engage with the opportunities that we provide, because otherwise all hope is lost in that regard. Such development is not without pain. That's where the global support by universities needs to come in as well. For example, helping students overcome stress. And it might not always be to do with culture shocks, as I mentioned here. It might also be to do with stress from home, stress with friends, stress with boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. I've come across quite different facets of psychological stress that are not all rooted in cultural experiences. But of course, things like if you have a very diverse campus community, things like discrimination can be a reason for why students feel less included, less integrated, for very good reasons, because nobody makes them feel at home. And again, I'm very sure this is something that's on your radar. And the more you internationalize your campus community, the more an issue this will become. So without reassuring students could suffer negative emotions, but at the same time, we also want to encourage them to face those negative emotions. What we just don't want is that they face them alone or face them without feeling that they are taken care of. In most of the assignments that my students have to write in one of my modules is about negative emotions that they experienced, and helping them to cope with them, because intercultural learning involves reaching beyond the boundaries of your comfort zone. And last but not least, foreign languages are an important first step, because the moment you decide to learn a foreign language, you decide to immerse yourself in a different culture, because language is part of our culture. It's an important component of it. It enables us to learn about other cultures in ways that it would not be possible if we were to just stick with our native language. And obviously, it's the first way of interacting with people from other cultures, especially if they don't speak your language or if there's no common denominator language to use. Last but not least, one last slide, and I felt like I couldn't leave you without referring at least once to the pandemic, because you might say like, yeah, that's all great, but what does that mean in the context of the pandemic that we're in? And unfortunately, it seems we might come out of it too quickly, because there's always ups and downs. Now, these insights are largely based on more recent research that I've done. Recently, we also hosted a summer university with a Chinese university, and some other initiatives that took place. And I think what's very remarkable is that the pandemic actually emphasizes existing issues around integration. So if your students already don't feel integrated, it's not going to get better if you're not on campus, obviously. So if there's no opportunity for them to personally interact with others, it's not going to work. So the question is just, how can you turn the experiences that you offered them on campus into online experiences, which obviously would be worth another talk, another webinar by itself. But that's something that I feel like most universities now try to achieve in the second round of pandemic teaching, as it were, because the first time we all got a little bit overwhelmed, I would say, or struck by surprise, that suddenly everything has to go online, everything is getting really worse. Nobody would have expected that, and nobody honestly would have wanted it. So recreating these social experiences are 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more challenging if students are located in different places. No matter how hard we try, it's very difficult to create this kind of social integration aspect. Surprisingly, less problematic is the academic side of things. Academic integration works relatively well. It's very easy to convert things that we've done, exercises we've done in the curriculum context into an online context or a hybrid context. Very often students are very happy with the content that we deliver online these days. And I think that's what was the emphasis of the first wave that we've all experienced, is how can we create the same high quality study experience for students in our lectures, and less maybe thinking about the experiences outside the lecture necessarily. And integration in general needs rethinking because of it. Of course, once the pandemic has been overcome, we might be able to go back to more normal ways of integrating and communicating and working and learning and teaching on campus. But until then, all the publications that exist, including the data that I've showed you today, need some rethinking in terms of what does integration actually mean. We need to remodel it. We need to see to which extent is it fit for purpose for a fully online, fully digital, or blended study experience. Knowing that integration before the pandemic was the most influential factor in helping students develop those global communication skills, especially the social integration aspect, not so much the academic one. It's probably paramount to consider how can we think about social integration on campus in new ways, in more innovative ways. And unfortunately, and that's the big unfortunately, I don't have yet all the answers to this. And of course, I would be very curious to know whether you have any initiatives that you run in your universities that actually address exactly these kind of aspects. Another big but at the very end, before we go to the Q&A section, is obviously this is just one way of looking at student study experiences. There's many more valid ways to look at them. And I certainly hold no claim that this is the holy grail of understanding global communication skills development. But the main aim of our research and of the Global Education Profiler is to look at the blind spot, to look at those things that maybe are not necessarily apparent to us as institutions, as policymakers, as an international officer in the Department for International Affairs, who is worried most of the time, how can I make the experience for our international students great together with the home students? And yeah, so that's really what I wanted to kind of get across here is there are opportunities already. It might not necessarily be that you haven't done enough. It might just be that students haven't necessarily done enough. And it's the responsibility of both the institution, the department, any unit in the university, but also the students, because you can fight endless battles with students who just don't see the point of developing those skills. And they just have to learn it in another way than in the university context, I guess, at least at the latest when they meet the employer and they say like, can you do this? And then they're not performing the way the employer expected. And that's the hard way to learn, I would argue. But hopefully that's the minority of students that we encounter on our campuses. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm afraid you're on mute, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, now if you can stop sharing the slide. So yeah, we can see you better here. Now, yeah, I mean, it was great that you brought the post-pandemic sort of situation, to discuss, because, just like you said, if social integration on campus, all those extracurricular activities that engages the students, that brings them together, those things were the things that we've been missing when our education moved online. And yeah, I mean, physical sort of study abroad programs, physical international mobilities mostly stopped. So we tried to create sort of virtual experiences for our students to bring them together, like virtual exchange programs. We organized our summer school and winter schools completely online with some extra sort of activities. But we really found it very difficult to create those, social interaction situations. And it's, I think what the students have been missing in all these sort of virtual experiences. So any sort of maybe best practices from your institution about virtual programs? It could be virtual study abroad, it could be virtual student festivals. What virtual things have you done? Try to emulate those experiences as much as possible.
Yeah, I think there's broadly speaking two levels where these things take place. On the one hand, of course, digitizing things like Welcome Week, which is the week where all students are supposed to get together. These are much more difficult to handle digitally because obviously internet connectivity might be the biggest bottleneck, I think, to most of these things that we try to digitize. So we try to translate many of the content or a lot of the content into a digital context. But I think on the another level, especially on departmental level, where I think most of the social integration really starts, because that's where you have your more personal contact with staff members is through the department and not necessarily with the pro-vice chancellor of the university or other departments. That's rather unlikely, I would assume. But what we try to do there is create social spaces, for example, with Microsoft Teams. I think having one platform is certainly a good starting point. Where you can do many things. Doesn't have to be the platform that's best at everything, but if you have one space, like a study space that students either can create by themselves or provided by the department, are very important. But then, of course, you also need to be there in those study rooms. So I think one of the things that changed quite dramatically is the amount of time that we try to spend online in those rooms with students. Organizing events, obviously, still remains the same. In some ways, it's become easier with having guest speakers from all around the world, very easily accessible through Zoom, for example, like in this case, or Microsoft Teams or whatever platform you use. So that's actually an advantage. I think we very often get hung up on the problems that online teaching creates for us or the online experience creates for us. But I think trying to map everything one by one is not going to work. Instead, you might actually find that some of the things work better online than they did face-to-face, but you didn't look at them in that way. So things that we do are, for example, the guest talks that now are basically digital. That's an example of where we basically one-to-one replaced something that we already did and can be easily done technically, and makes hardly any difference to students. If anything, it's more comfortable for them if it's early in the morning, they can still be in bed, not turn on the camera, and move on from there. If I look at my modules, for example, obviously, team spaces for students to work in groups is quite important. And especially in term one, where people don't know each other, it's important to foster the idea of, oh yeah, we need to talk to each other more frequently. And to be honest, this is certainly something that we still need to work on, because just because students work towards a common goal doesn't allow them to socially mingle with each other. So there's certain challenges that we still face and we actually don't have yet fully completed. I mean, I'm proud to say that Warwick apparently just recently has been announced to be the best university of the year in terms of teaching experiences. So we do something right. But I think I would find it tough to pinpoint what exactly it was. And I think it's probably the mixture of the different initiatives and this emphasis on trying to not replicate everything one-to-one, take what worked well before and see whether you can easily turn it into an online experience. But when it comes to the social aspects, this is still a challenge to create something that's remotely similar. Because when it comes to using Microsoft Teams, for example, which is the platform we use primarily, students always associate academic studies with it. It's not a place to hang out. So things that we try to do this year, for example, is not necessarily that we go into the spaces where students socially hang out, but maybe find ways for students to actually connect with each other on these social platforms that they personally are available, and not necessarily through a study lens or a university lens, because students just wouldn't want me to be in the same group as with their friends on WhatsApp or whatever they might use. That's awkward, I think, for everyone involved. So obviously, encouraging students to, for example, create these WhatsApp groups for personal communication is something that we will foster this year, certainly much more strongly, because we realize, yeah, we're doing well academically. Students appreciate our lectures, they find it interactive enough. We're doing all the things that everybody says we should do, like every 3 minutes and add tasks to keep the attention up, all the things that you might have come across before, but most of them are focused on the academic experience. And when it comes to social experience, I think we're just at the beginning of trying to create new spaces, things that worked well last year, but also things that could be expanded a little bit more, especially with things, we have a lot of Chinese students. So this year we certainly will encourage to have some sort of a social event that's related to Chinese New Year. Now is Mid-Autumn Festival, so I think that's a little too early for them because term hasn't started yet. But there's definitely ways we want to encourage them. One thing that we want to do is we call it the meeting of chums, which is an opportunity for students to present their hometown, for example, or in some cases their home country, if it's not represented well in the program yet. to give small presentations about what makes the city unique or what makes the district unique. If you have, I don't know, 10 students from Beijing, they can all talk about their own district and give cultural insights into that, because that's part of our curriculum as well. It's part of our program, MSc in Intercultural Communication for Business and the Professions. So it's maybe less about business and professions, but it's more about the intercultural aspect. And we know that it worked very well face-to-face before. And we're thinking now of transforming it in some shape or form, just not one-to-one, because that's not possible, into a cultural experience for students online. That's nothing to do with the program per se, but a way of presenting their own country, presenting themselves in some ways to other students. And students then just can go around, as it were, with timed slots, so that you can go from one table to the next table or from one room to the next room with dedicated rooms online. So these are just some examples that we explore and try to recreate and that we had before largely. But obviously it's not the only way, and we are all in the same boat in that regard. We're still trying to figure things out. We only know that social integration is going to be a huge component of what we try to develop, at least in our department, in terms of student experiences for the coming year, since we more or less sorted out the academic part last year, which obviously had to have priority because that's what students come here for. But it shouldn't be the only criterion. And since we tell our students at the end of it, you should have these global communication skills, and now you should have on top this digital global communication skills by working and having to work around the world with people from different countries. That's on the one hand an opportunity, but on the other hand, an additional challenge for them to cope with.
Great. Yeah, we hosted a lot of online events, but social events for our international students as well during the pandemic. So yeah, trying to create sort of hobby nights, or watching a movie and commenting on it, online coffee hour, and things like that. Our international student office has done a lot of work, but something you talked about during the webinar, it's hard to sometimes connect the local students into those international student events, and that's always a challenge. But maybe this year we'll try to sort of work on that a little, more proactively. Try to bring the local students and maybe create social environments for the local and the international students to interact online as well. So yeah, there's a lot to do, and hopefully coming back to our campuses, at least for a while in this academic year, will give us a chance to do the old-fashioned student festivals and events as well, so that there can be at least some face-to-face interaction among our international student body and local students as well. So we're hoping for the best going into the new academic year.
Exactly.
So thank you so much
no problem.
for your contribution. And you have the slides in the chat box. So if any of our audience members wish to take a look at them again and maybe use some of the insights for policy making at the university, or creating some new programs and initiatives for campus support to students, they can refer to your slides. It's in the chat box. Thank you so much, Daniel. Hope to see you virtually or in person at the next EURI. We'll see.
Exactly, that would be great. And can I just add one more sentence?
Sure.
Because it just creeped into my mind as a reminder. If you ask me if there's one thing I would recommend to increase social interaction in curriculum and outside, is on the very first day, make clear, depends on your infrastructure, of course, but make it very clear that cameras need to be on at all times for students. Unless there is, of course, reasons if the connectivity is bad, and then this is the only way to do it. But at least when they're outside, if they do group work or whatnot, we try to instill this culture now this year much more strongly than we did last year. Because as a staff member, you feel the difference as well. And if you feel the difference, you will also feel it as a student, I'm pretty sure. So one thing that we will implement this year is telling students, if you're in small groups and you work on group work assignments, you are required to turn on your camera.
That's a
unless
very
there's
good
very good reasons
practical tip.
Great.
Great.
But I feel that makes a huge difference, because looking at the logo or something, and not even knowing whether this person is here if they're on mute, that can create some problems for students themselves, but also cause, of course, harm to the social integration experience per se. So being able to see the other person, at least, if not in person, then at least digitally, can help with social integration aspects of university experiences. So that's maybe the one thing I would recommend.
Well, that's a great practical tip, a takeaway from this webinar today for our audience. Thank you so much, and
thank you very much for having
everyone.
me.
Stay safe.
Yeah, take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.